The strangest thing about starting over is that nobody applauds the moment you quietly decide your old life no longer fits. My name is Claire Bennett, I was 49 years old, and on the first Monday of October I unlocked the front door of my antique restoration studio believing the day would be as ordinary as every other Monday before it. The crisp Michigan air followed me inside, carrying the scent of wet maple leaves and fresh coffee from the cafe across the street, while sunlight slipped through the front windows and settled across half-finished picture frames waiting for careful hands and impossible patience. I had spent more than 20 years repairing objects that strangers believed were beyond saving, yet I still hadn't figured out how to restore the invisible cracks inside myself. My divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, and everyone around me insisted I was brave, resilient, even inspiring, but bravery is often just another word people use when they don't know how lonely someone really feels. Every morning I repeated the same routine because routines never judged you. I unlocked the cabinets, turned on the soft jazz station, watered the fern beside the register, and whispered good morning to a collection of century-old clocks that always seemed more reliable than people. Business had been steady enough to keep the lights on, but the silence between customers had become louder with every passing week. My closest friends encouraged me to travel, to join clubs, to download dating apps, but none of those suggestions sounded like they belonged to the woman staring back at me in the polished brass mirror hanging near the entrance. She looked composed, capable, and completely invisible. Around 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a reminder about the Historical Society fundraiser scheduled for Friday evening. I had promised to restore a donated grandfather clock before the event, and canceling wasn't an option because keeping promises had become the one thing I still trusted about myself. As I carried the clock's pendulum toward my workbench, the bell above the front door chimed. I expected another collector or perhaps a curious tourist, escaping the chilly weather, but instead a calm, confident voice said, "I hope I'm not interrupting history while it's being repaired." I looked up and found a woman standing beneath the doorway with rain-speckled auburn hair tucked behind one ear, a navy coat folded neatly over one arm, and a warm smile that somehow felt both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. She couldn't have been older than 35. She held a leather portfolio instead of a shopping bag, and her thoughtful green eyes wandered across the studio with genuine fascination rather than polite curiosity. "I'm looking for Claire Bennett," she said. "People told me you're the only person in the state who can bring forgotten things back to life." I almost laughed at the irony because if that were true, I wondered why I still hadn't managed to do the same for myself. Before I answered, the old grandfather clock behind me released a deep, steady chime that echoed through the quiet room like it had been patiently waiting for this exact moment. And for reasons I couldn't explain, it felt less like the beginning of another workday and more like the first page of a story I never expected to live. The woman stepped farther into the studio, carefully closing the door behind her as the autumn wind faded into silence. "I am Emily Carter," she said, extending her hand with the quiet confidence of someone who never felt the need to fill every empty second with conversation. Her handshake was warm, steady, and professional, the kind that instantly put people at ease without trying too hard. "I represent the Whitmore Historical Foundation. We recently acquired a collection from an estate outside Traverse City, and every expert we spoke with gave us the same name." I smiled politely, although compliments had become strangely difficult to accept after the past year. "That depends on what they told you," I replied. Emily laughed softly, a genuine laugh that reached her eyes before fading into a thoughtful smile. "They said you never restore an object until you understand its story." I glanced toward the weathered grandfather clock resting on my workbench. "That part is true." She carefully opened the leather portfolio and spread several photographs across the counter. Each image revealed beautifully crafted furniture, antique oil paintings, handwritten journals, and an ornate cedar chest decorated with delicate floral carvings that had softened with age. "Most of these pieces belong to Eleanor Whitmore," Emily explained. "She documented almost every detail of her life, but nobody in the family has touched the collection since she passed away. They want everything preserved before the house is sold." I picked up one photograph showing the cedar chest sitting beneath a large bay window. The afternoon sunlight pouring across its surface reminded me of countless homes where memories had quietly settled into wood and fabric long after the people themselves were gone. "This will take months," I said honestly. "Possibly longer." "That is exactly why I came to you," Emily answered without hesitation. There was no pressure in her voice, only patience. It caught me off guard because so many clients wanted miracles on impossible deadlines. She seemed more interested in doing things properly than doing them quickly. We spent nearly an hour discussing finishes, humidity damage, insurance paperwork, transportation logistics, and preservation techniques. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, moving naturally between technical details and small observations about history, architecture, and forgotten craftsmanship. I found myself relaxing in ways I had not expected, occasionally smiling without realizing it. At one point, Emily paused beside an old mahogany writing desk waiting for restoration. She gently traced a finger just above the worn surface without touching it. My grandmother used to say furniture remembers every family that loved it. I looked at her for a second longer than I intended. Mine used to say the same thing. We shared a brief silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Outside, rain began tapping lightly against the front windows, turning the afternoon sky into soft shades of gray. Emily checked her watch and sighed almost reluctantly. I should probably head back before the roads get worse. She gathered the photographs but left a small brass key on the counter. That opens the Whitmore house. I would like you to see everything before making your decision. No pressure. Just take a look. I picked up the key, surprised by its unexpected weight. It was cool against my palm, its edges worn smooth by decades of careful use. Emily smiled once more before slipping on her coat. Sometimes old places only tell their stories to the right person. After the bell above the door chimed behind her, the studio became quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. I stood alone holding the antique key while rain blurred the streets outside, wondering why a simple piece of brass suddenly felt less like an invitation to restore forgotten history, and more like the first step toward rediscovering something inside myself that I had quietly assumed was gone forever. 2 days later, I found myself driving north beneath a sky washed clean by overnight rain, the brass key resting in the cup holder beside me like a quiet promise. The farther I traveled from the city, the more familiar the landscape became. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests dressed in brilliant shades of crimson, amber, and gold, while narrow country roads curved between old farms that looked as though they had been standing patiently for generations. The Whitmore house appeared at the end of a long maple-lined driveway, larger than I had imagined yet somehow welcoming rather than intimidating. Its white clapboard exterior had weathered gracefully, and wide windows reflected the soft afternoon light. Emily's SUV was already parked near the front porch. She stepped outside before I reached the front steps, wearing a forest green sweater, blue jeans, and sturdy boots that somehow made her seem less like a foundation representative and more like someone who belonged to the house itself. "I was hoping you would come," she said with an easy smile. "I almost convinced myself not to," I admitted. She tilted her head slightly. "Because of the project?" I looked at the old home standing quietly behind her. "Because sometimes saying yes to something new feels more frightening than staying exactly where you are." She nodded as though she understood far more than I had actually said. Together we unlocked the front door, and a faint scent of cedar, old paper, and polished wood greeted us before the lights even came on. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight while every room seemed frozen in time, not abandoned but patiently waiting. Instead of rushing me through the property, Emily allowed me to wander at my own pace. She watched silently as I examined carved banisters, hand-painted tiles around the fireplace, and delicate crown molding that had survived nearly a century. Every object carried tiny signs of ordinary lives. A bookmark left inside a cookbook, a pair of reading glasses folded beside an armchair, fresh flowers pressed between the pages of an old family Bible. None of it felt staged. It felt remembered. "Most people see antiques," Emily said quietly from across the room. "You seem to notice the people who touched them." I smiled without looking away from an embroidered quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair. "That is because people always leave more behind than they realize." We eventually reached the library, where floor-to-ceiling shelves wrapped around 3 walls. In the center stood the cedar chest from the photographs. Time had dulled its finish, but the craftsmanship remained extraordinary. I knelt beside it, carefully studying the carved flowers before brushing away a thin layer of dust with the back of my fingertips. "Beautiful," I whispered almost to myself. Emily crouched beside me, close enough that I noticed the faint scent of cedar mixed with fresh linen. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence felt natural, filled not with awkwardness but shared appreciation. When I finally opened the lid, neatly stacked journals rested inside beside faded letters tied together with pale blue ribbon. On top lay a single envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. To the woman who believes broken things deserve another chance. I stared at the words, convinced there had to be some explanation, some coincidence that made the message less personal than it suddenly felt. Emily leaned forward slowly, reading the same sentence, and when our eyes met neither of us spoke because neither of us seemed capable of explaining why a letter written decades earlier felt as though it had been waiting specifically for this moment. Emily carefully lifted the envelope from the cedar chest, as though she feared the paper itself might crumble beneath the weight of expectation. The seal had already loosened with age, making it clear that time, not curiosity, had opened it first. She looked at me without speaking, silently offering me the choice. I drew a slow breath before unfolding the single handwritten page inside. The elegant script was steady and graceful, carrying the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime believing that words mattered. It began simply, "If you are reading this, then someone has finally cared enough to look beyond what is broken." I felt something tighten quietly inside my chest. The letter was not addressed to any specific person after all. It was written for whoever arrived with enough patience to listen. Eleanor described the house not as a building but as a collection of borrowed moments, explaining that every scratch on the furniture, every faded photograph, and every repaired crack represented proof that ordinary lives deserved to be remembered. She wrote that people often abandoned beautiful things because restoring them required more courage than replacing them. By the time I reached the final paragraph, the room around me had become remarkably still. "If you have spent your life repairing forgotten treasures," the letter read, "please remember that the hands capable of restoring history are worthy of restoration themselves." I lowered the page and stared quietly at the cedar chest. Emily remained beside me, saying nothing for several seconds. "My grandmother left notes everywhere," she finally said with a gentle smile. She believed strangers sometimes needed encouragement more than family did. I looked up in surprise. "Your grandmother?" Emily nodded. "Eleanor Whitmore was my grandmother." I blinked, realizing she had never actually mentioned the connection. Somehow the discovery explained the tenderness with which she had spoken about the estate from the very beginning. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked. She folded her hands loosely in front of her. "Because I wanted you to see the collection before you saw my last name. I needed to know whether you loved the work itself, or simply wanted another prestigious client." Her honesty caught me completely off guard. Instead of feeling tested, I felt respected. We spent the rest of the afternoon opening cabinets, examining furniture joints, cataloging framed artwork, and carefully documenting everything that would require restoration. Every room revealed another small story. A kitchen table marked by decades of family dinners. A hallway where children's heights had been penciled onto the trim each birthday. A music room containing an upright piano with yellowed sheet music still resting on the stand. It felt impossible to rush through any of it. As daylight slowly softened into early evening, golden light poured through the western windows, filling the library with a warm glow that made the polished wood appear almost alive. Emily disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with 2 steaming mugs of apple cider. "Family tradition," she said, handing one to me. "Grandmother believed no important decision should ever be made on an empty stomach." I laughed quietly, surprised by how natural it felt. We stood together near the tall library windows watching orange leaves drift across the lawn, while the old house settled around us with soft creaks that sounded more comforting than lonely. For the first time in months I realized an entire afternoon had passed without me thinking about my divorce, my empty apartment, or the version of myself I believed I had lost. Instead I found myself wondering how one ordinary conversation could make silence feel less like isolation and more like the beginning of trust, and I could not decide whether the greatest restoration waiting inside the Whitmore house belonged to its treasured antiques or to the quiet corners of 2 lives that neither of us had expected to open again. The following Monday the Whitmore house no longer felt like a museum waiting for strangers to catalog its contents. It felt like a place slowly waking up. Every morning I left my apartment before sunrise with a travel mug of coffee balanced beside my toolbox, and by the time the first rays of light filtered through the old maple trees, I was already unlocking the front door. Emily usually arrived a few minutes later carrying fresh pastries from a bakery in the nearby town, insisting that restoration required as much energy as patience. I stopped arguing after the second morning because she was always right. We quickly settled into an effortless rhythm. While I documented furniture damage and prepared restoration plans, she organized family records, labeled photographs, and carefully researched each object's history so nothing meaningful would disappear during the process. Hours passed without either of us noticing. Sometimes we worked in complete silence, interrupted only by the gentle scrape of sandpaper or the quiet ticking of antique clocks that seemed grateful to be running again. Other times we shared stories that had nothing to do with restoration. Emily told me about growing up spending every summer in the house with her grandmother, learning to identify birds from the back porch, and pressing wildflowers inside old novels. I admitted that I had once dreamed of becoming a museum curator before life led me toward opening my own studio instead. Neither dream felt like a mistake anymore. Late one afternoon, I stood on a ladder repairing decorative molding above the library shelves, while Emily sorted handwritten journals below. "You know," she said without looking up, "Grandmother believed every person had one room where they felt most like themselves. This library was hers." I smiled while carefully smoothing fresh wood filler into a narrow crack. "Mine has always been whatever room needed fixing." Emily laughed quietly. "That sounds exactly like you." I paused, surprised by how confidently she said it. We had known each other only a short time, yet she spoke as though she had been quietly observing me for years instead of days. A few minutes later, she discovered an old photograph tucked between two journal pages. "Claire," she called gently. I climbed down from the ladder and joined her beside the reading table. The faded photograph showed Eleanor standing beside another woman in front of the house nearly 50 years earlier. They were smiling naturally, shoulders lightly touching, completely comfortable in one another's presence. There was nothing dramatic about the picture, yet it radiated the kind of quiet happiness that could not be staged. On the back, Eleanor had written in careful handwriting, "Some people arrive long after you stop searching, and somehow they still find you exactly when you are ready." Emily traced the edge of the photograph with thoughtful fingers before smiling to herself. She always had a way with words. I slipped the photograph back into its protective sleeve, unable to explain why Eleanor's sentence lingered in my thoughts long after we returned to work. As evening settled across the property, rain began falling unexpectedly, drumming softly against the roof while gray clouds swallowed the last of the daylight. Emily glanced toward the windows before checking her phone. The Weather Service just issued a flood advisory. The county road is already partially underwater. She looked at me with an apologetic expression. "You probably should not try driving back tonight." I instinctively reached for my keys anyway before realizing she was right. The rain was only getting heavier. Emily smiled reassuringly. "There are plenty of guest rooms upstairs. Grandmother always believed no visitor should ever feel rushed into leaving because of a storm." I looked around the warmly lit library, listened to the comforting rhythm of rain against the windows, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the idea of staying somewhere unfamiliar did not fill me with anxiety. Instead, it felt strangely comforting, as though the old house itself had quietly decided neither of us was quite ready for the day to end. Rain continued through the night with a steady rhythm that echoed gently across the old roof, making the entire house feel wrapped inside its own quiet world. Emily showed me to a guest room overlooking the orchard behind the property, where a handmade quilt rested neatly across the bed, and a small vase of dried lavender still stood on the windowsill as though someone expected visitors every weekend, instead of every few years. "Grandmother never believed in closing doors permanently," Emily said as she handed me a folded towel. "She always kept every room ready for the possibility that someone might need a place to stay." After she wished me good night, I stood alone for several minutes looking out at the rain blurring the trees beyond the glass. I realized I could not remember the last time I had spent a night somewhere that felt peaceful rather than unfamiliar. My apartment had become orderly after the divorce, but it had never truly felt comforting again. Here, surrounded by old wood, family photographs, and the faint scent of cedar drifting through the hallway, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The following morning I woke before sunrise. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a silver mist floating above the fields. I pulled on a sweater and quietly wandered downstairs, expecting the house to still be asleep. Instead, I found Emily standing in the kitchen beside an old cast-iron stove, humming softly while pancake batter rested in a large ceramic bowl. Sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows, catching tiny dust particles that drifted lazily through the warm air. She looked over her shoulder and smiled. "Good morning. I guessed you would wake up early." I laughed. "Occupational habit. Antique restorers and bakers probably keep the same schedule." "Then you arrived just in time." She handed me a mug of fresh coffee before turning another pancake with practiced ease. Without discussing it, we slipped naturally into working together. I sliced apples while she prepared breakfast, and before long conversation flowed as comfortably as it had inside the library. She asked about the first antique I had ever restored. I told her about a broken music box my father rescued from a flea market when I was 13, explaining that hearing it play again had changed the direction of my life. Emily listened without interrupting, smiling at exactly the right moments, never rushing me toward the end of the story. When I finished, she rested both hands around her coffee mug. "You always describe objects as though they have feelings," she observed. Gently. I shrugged with an embarrassed smile. "Maybe because people usually throw things away before asking whether they can still be saved." Her expression softened. "I think you believe that about people too." The words lingered between us. I looked down at the steam rising from my coffee because answering honestly suddenly felt more difficult than discussing any restoration project. After a quiet moment, I admitted, "I used to." Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing it applied to me. Emily did not argue. She simply reached into a nearby drawer and removed another of Eleanor's journals. She opened to a page marked by a pressed maple leaf and turned the book toward me. Written neatly across the top was a single sentence. "The hardest person to forgive is often the one looking back at you in the mirror." I read the words twice before closing the journal carefully. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the last of the clouds, illuminating the orchard with brilliant shades of gold, and as Emily and I carried breakfast onto the back porch, I found myself smiling without effort, wondering whether healing sometimes arrives so quietly that you only recognized it after your heart had already begun making room for hope again. Over the next week, the house settled into a comforting routine that felt almost timeless. Every morning brought another room to examine, another forgotten drawer to open, another story patiently waiting beneath layers of dust and careful preservation. I began leaving my apartment earlier than necessary, telling myself it was because there was so much work to finish before winter arrived, but somewhere deep inside I recognized a quieter truth. I looked forward to seeing Emily. She never greeted me with exaggerated enthusiasm or unnecessary questions. Instead, she offered a warm smile, fresh coffee, and the reassuring feeling that someone was genuinely happy I had arrived. It was a simple kindness, yet after months of carrying my loneliness without complaint, it felt extraordinary. One Thursday afternoon, we carried several restored picture frames into the upstairs hallway where family portraits once again lined the walls. Emily stepped back to admire the display while I adjusted the angle of the final frame until it caught the afternoon sunlight just right. "There," I said softly. "Now it looks like they never left." Emily folded her arms and looked at the photographs for several quiet seconds. "You do not just repair wood and glass," she said. "You return dignity to memories." I smiled awkwardly, unsure how to accept compliments that felt so sincere. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. The screen displayed a name I had not seen in nearly a month. David. My former husband. My chest tightened almost automatically. Emily noticed the expression on my face but said nothing. She simply turned toward the nearby window, giving me the privacy I had not asked for but deeply appreciated. I hesitated before answering. David's voice sounded familiar in the unsettling way old songs sometimes do. Comfortable once, distant now. He asked how I had been, whether the business was doing well, whether I had considered meeting for coffee to talk because he believed enough time had passed for both of us to be friends. I listened politely, staring out at the orchard while fallen leaves drifted across the grass like tiny golden boats. Months earlier, I would have searched desperately for hidden meaning inside every word he spoke. Now I realized I felt something unexpected. Gratitude for what we had shared. sadness for what we had lost, but not the longing I once believed would never disappear. "I truly hope you are happy, David," I said calmly. "I think we both deserve that. But I also think some chapters are meant to stay finished." There was a brief silence before he quietly wished me well. When the call ended, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and released a breath I had not realized I was holding. Emily walked over without asking what had happened. She simply stood beside me, looking out the same window. "You look lighter," she observed after a moment. I laughed softly. "I think I finally put something down that I had been carrying for far too long." She nodded with quiet understanding. "Grandmother always said forgiveness is not something we give another person first. It is something we finally allow ourselves." Neither of us spoke again for several minutes. The silence felt peaceful instead of empty. As we turned to continue our work, my sleeve brushed lightly against hers. It was the smallest of accidents, gone almost before it happened, yet neither of us stepped away immediately. We simply exchanged an unhurried smile before returning to the photographs waiting to be hung, and for the first time I realized I was no longer measuring my life by everything that had ended. Without even noticing when it happened, I had quietly begun measuring it by everything that was beginning instead. The final week of restoration arrived almost without warning, and the Whitmore house seemed to sense the approaching farewell before either of us admitted it aloud. The library shelves stood polished once again. The cedar chest glowed beneath a fresh protective finish, and every carefully restored frame reflected warm afternoon light instead of years of neglect. Walking through the rooms no longer felt like exploring forgotten history. It felt like visiting a home that had quietly remembered how to breathe again. Emily and I moved through our work with the familiar ease that only grows from shared days and unspoken understanding. Sometimes one of us reached for a tool at the exact moment the other had already placed it within reach. Sometimes we finished each other's observations before either sentence had completely formed. Neither of us ever mentioned how naturally it happened. One crisp afternoon, the historical foundation board arrived to inspect the completed project. They wandered from room to room offering enthusiastic praise, complimenting every restored detail and congratulating Emily for preserving such an important family estate. I remained mostly in the background, answering technical questions whenever someone asked, but preferring to let the house speak for itself. As the final guest prepared to leave, an older board member paused beside the restored grandfather clock in the foyer. He turned toward Emily with an approving smile. "Your grandmother would have been proud. Selling the property will be much easier now." His words landed with unexpected weight. Selling the property. Until that moment I had somehow convinced myself the house would simply remain exactly as it was, waiting quietly for another season. Emily thanked him politely, but I noticed the faint hesitation in her smile. After everyone had driven away, silence settled across the porch once more. I found her standing alone near the orchard, watching late afternoon sunlight drift across the trees. "I did not realize the sale was happening this soon," I admitted carefully. She nodded without looking away from the horizon. "The paperwork is almost finished. The foundation cannot afford the maintenance anymore. Keeping the collection was possible. Keeping the house was not." I searched for the right response but found none. The thought of these rooms belonging to strangers suddenly felt far more personal than it should have. Emily finally looked at me, her expression gentle but undeniably sad. I kept hoping I would think of another solution. "Maybe one still exists," I said quietly, although I had no idea what it might be. She smiled with grateful uncertainty before changing the subject, asking whether I would attend the dedication ceremony scheduled for Saturday morning. I agreed immediately, but the excitement I had felt only hours earlier had quietly disappeared. That evening we remained inside longer than usual, organizing the last of Eleanor's journals into archival boxes. As I closed the final volume, a folded page slipped onto the library floor. Emily picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It contained another brief note written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. "Some homes are not built to last forever. They are built to teach people how to find their way back to themselves before letting them continue the journey." Emily read the words aloud, then looked at me with eyes that reflected equal parts gratitude and uncertainty. Neither of us spoke after that. Outside, the first stars appeared above the orchard while the restored grandfather clock chimed the hour with calm, unwavering confidence. And although everything around us finally seemed complete, I could not escape the quiet feeling that the most important part of our story had only just reached the moment where everything was about to change. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in brilliant sunshine that made the Whitmore house glow with quiet dignity, as though every restored window and polished floor had been waiting years for this exact light. Guests from the Historical Foundation, local preservation groups, and neighboring families wandered through the rooms with warm expressions and genuine admiration, stopping often to study details that had once been hidden beneath age and neglect. Hearing complete strangers speak with affection about craftsmanship, history, and memory filled me with a satisfaction I had nearly forgotten was possible. I stood near the library doorway answering questions about restoration techniques when Emily caught my eye from across the room. She did not wave or call my name. She simply smiled, and somehow that small gesture steadied me more than all the compliments I had received throughout the morning. After the final visitors departed, volunteers folded chairs and carried refreshments back to their vehicles until the property slowly returned to silence. Only the two of us remained, standing on the wide front porch while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the orchard. Emily rested both hands on the porch railing before speaking. "Thank you," she said quietly, "not only for restoring the house, for helping me see it one last time the way my grandmother always wanted people to experience it." I looked toward the front lawn where sunlight danced across the grass. "I should be thanking you. I came here believing I was accepting another project. I did not realize I was also accepting a chance to remember who I used to be." She turned toward me with an expression I had never seen before, one that balanced hope and uncertainty with remarkable honesty. "Claire, there is something I have wanted to tell you for several days." My heart responded before my thoughts did, beating just a little faster. She laughed softly, almost embarrassed by her own hesitation. "I kept waiting for the perfect moment, but grandmother always said perfect moments usually disappear while people are busy waiting for them." I smiled. She seems to have been right about almost everything. Emily drew a slow breath. "When this project began, I admired your work. Then I admired your patience. Somewhere between shared breakfasts, dusty journals, and endless afternoons in the library, I realized I was looking forward to every conversation we had, even the quiet ones." She paused, searching my face rather than the ground. "I do not expect anything from you. I only wanted to be honest before this house belongs to someone else." The world seemed to grow wonderfully still. I thought about the frightened woman who had first unlocked her studio months earlier, believing the best chapters of her life had already passed. That version of me would have hidden behind caution, convinced that beginning again was something reserved for younger people with fewer disappointments. Instead, I stepped a little closer, close enough to see sunlight reflected in Emily's green eyes. "You are not the only one who has been looking forward to every morning," I admitted. "Somewhere along the way I stopped driving here because of the restoration work. I started coming because you were here." A smile spread slowly across her face, bright enough to erase every lingering doubt between us. We stood together in comfortable silence as autumn leaves drifted across the porch, neither of us rushing to define what came next because, for the first time in a very long while, neither of us felt the need to hurry. The future no longer felt like an empty road waiting to be feared. It felt like an open door quietly inviting us to discover whatever stories still remained unwritten, together. The following week unfolded with a quiet sense of possibility that neither of us tried to explain too quickly. We agreed that whatever was beginning between us deserved patience, not because we doubted it, but because we respected it. Every morning Emily stopped by my restoration studio before heading to meetings at the Historical Foundation, carrying coffee from the same little cafe across the street that had unknowingly witnessed the lonely routine I once believed would never change. Now the owner greeted us with a familiar smile, already remembering Emily's favorite cinnamon scone and my usual dark roast. Small rituals like that somehow made everything feel more real. My workshop also seemed different. The clocks no longer sounded lonely. The polished furniture reflected more than sunlight, and the quiet hours between customers had transformed into moments I actually enjoyed instead of endured. Emily occasionally sat beside my workbench reviewing foundation documents while I restored another forgotten treasure, and we spoke easily about everything from architecture to favorite childhood books, from autumn road trips to the places we still hope to visit someday. One rainy afternoon, an elderly woman entered the studio carrying a weathered wooden rocking chair with one broken armrest and years of scratches across its faded finish. She apologized repeatedly for bringing something in such poor condition. Before I could answer, Emily smiled gently and said, "You came to exactly the right place." The woman looked around the workshop before studying the photographs hanging on the wall. "You two make a wonderful team," she observed with the matter-of-fact certainty that only comes from a lifetime of noticing people. Emily and I exchanged a brief glance before laughing softly. Neither of us rushed to correct her. After the customer left, Emily traced one finger lightly across the old workbench where generations of careful repairs had left tiny marks in the wood. "Do you ever think about how many second chances have started in this room?" she asked. I considered the question while adjusting the delicate hinge on a 19th-century jewelry box. "Every restored piece begins with someone refusing to give up on it," I replied. "Maybe people are not so different." She smiled thoughtfully. "That sounds like something your future self would have believed all along." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon because she was right. Months earlier, I had measured success by flawless restorations and carefully completed commissions. Now I realized the greatest change had happened somewhere I could not photograph or polish. It had happened quietly inside me. Later that evening, after we closed the studio together, we walked slowly toward the nearby river where maple leaves drifted across the water like tiny painted boats. The air carried the cool promise of approaching winter, but neither of us seemed eager to end the evening. We paused on a small pedestrian bridge overlooking the current, listening to the gentle sound of flowing water beneath us. Emily rested her hands on the wooden railing and looked toward the glowing city lights. "Grandmother used to say that every meaningful journey reaches a point where you stop asking whether you are brave enough to continue," she said softly. "Instead, you begin wondering why you ever believed you should walk it alone." I turned toward her with a smile that came effortlessly now. "I think Eleanor left enough wisdom to guide several lifetimes." Emily laughed quietly. "She would probably tell us the rest is up to us." Standing there beneath a sky filled with early evening stars, I realized she was right. The house had reminded us how to preserve what mattered. The restoration had taught us how quietly hope could return, and the road waiting beyond that bridge no longer felt uncertain. For the first time in years, the future was not something I needed to repair before I could trust it. It was simply something I was finally ready to live. Winter arrived gently that year, covering rooftops with a light blanket of snow that transformed familiar streets into something almost magical. My restoration studio became busier as families brought treasured heirlooms inside before the holidays, hoping old ornaments, clocks, and handcrafted furniture might once again become part of new memories. For the first time in years, I welcomed the steady rhythm of work without using it to hide from my own life. Emily visited nearly every afternoon after finishing meetings at the foundation, sometimes carrying warm soup from the cafe across the street, other times bringing another journal Eleanor had tucked away in an unexpected corner. We joked that her grandmother had planned enough surprises to last several lifetimes. One Saturday, the Historical Society invited both of us to speak during a preservation workshop for local volunteers. Standing together before a room filled with people of every age, I explained how restoring an antique always began by understanding its history before attempting to repair its visible damage. Emily followed by speaking about the importance of preserving family stories alongside physical objects, because memories disappeared much faster than wood or stone when nobody chose to protect them. Watching her speak with calm confidence filled me with quiet admiration. She never tried to impress people. She simply shared what mattered to her, and somehow everyone listened. After the presentation ended, several guests stayed behind to ask questions. An older gentleman approached carrying a faded photograph of his late parents standing beside a weathered farmhouse. "I cannot restore the house," he said softly, "but I would like to remember it properly." Emily looked toward me with the same gentle expression I had come to know so well. Together we helped him develop a plan to preserve the photograph, document the family history, and display it alongside several heirlooms his children had almost discarded. As he thanked us before leaving, tears shimmered briefly in his eyes. "You reminded me that letting go does not always mean losing something," he said. His words stayed with me long after the room had emptied. That evening we returned to my studio where fresh snow drifted quietly beyond the front windows. Emily wandered through the workshop studying completed restorations while I locked cabinets and switched off overhead lights one by one. The warm glow from the antique lamps created soft reflections across polished wood, making the familiar room feel almost dreamlike. "This place has changed," she observed. I smiled. "Or maybe I have." She walked slowly toward the old brass mirror hanging near the entrance, the same mirror that had once reflected a woman convinced her most meaningful years were behind her. I joined her there without speaking. Side by side, our reflections appeared calm, comfortable, and surprisingly hopeful. Emily looked at the mirror before turning toward me. "Do you remember what you told me the first day we met?" she asked. I laughed. Quietly. I said I repaired forgotten things. She nodded. "You forgot one important detail." I raised an eyebrow. "What was that?" Her smile carried the quiet certainty that had first drawn me toward her. "You never only repair objects. You remind people that time cannot erase their value." For a long moment I simply looked at her, realizing those words described not only my work but the life I had been given the chance to rebuild. Outside, snow continued falling in slow, graceful silence while the antique clocks around us marked another passing hour, and instead of reminding me how quickly time disappeared, they reminded me that every meaningful future begins with someone finally believing they are worthy of one. As December drew closer, the little town seemed to wrap itself in quiet traditions that had been repeated for generations. Storefront windows glowed with simple white lights, evergreen wreaths appeared on every front porch, and the first snowfall remained untouched across neighborhood parks until children transformed it into laughter by mid-morning. Emily convinced me to close the studio one Friday afternoon, so we could attend the annual holiday market organized by the Historical Foundation. Months earlier I would have declined without hesitation, claiming deadlines and unfinished projects. This time I locked the front door with genuine anticipation instead of reluctant obligation. The market occupied the restored train depot where local artists, woodworkers, bakers, and historians filled every corner with handmade gifts and familiar stories. Everywhere I looked someone seemed eager to introduce Emily to a neighbor or former teacher, and every introduction eventually turned into another conversation about restoration, preservation, or the Whitmore house. I watched her move through the crowd with effortless kindness, giving every person her full attention no matter how brief the exchange. It reminded me of Eleanor's journals. The greatest legacy anyone leaves behind is not property. It is the way people feel after sharing a moment with you. Late in the afternoon, Emily led me toward a small exhibition at the back of the depot. Mounted on the walls were photographs documenting restoration projects completed throughout the county over the past 20 years. I stopped walking when I recognized one familiar image: the Whitmore Library. Beside it hung another photograph taken only weeks earlier after our work had been completed. Beneath both images a small brass plaque read, "Restored through craftsmanship, preserved through compassion, dedicated to every person who believes forgotten places still deserve another chapter." I stood silently reading those words while visitors wandered quietly behind us. "You knew about this?" I asked. Emily smiled with obvious embarrassment. "Only part of it. The foundation wanted to recognize the project. I did not know they were adding the dedication until this morning." Before I could respond, the foundation director stepped onto the small stage in the center of the hall and invited everyone to gather for a brief announcement. He spoke about preserving history, honoring volunteers, and celebrating community partnerships before unexpectedly calling both of our names. We joined him beneath warm holiday lights while the audience applauded. He presented us with a framed photograph of the Whitmore house at sunrise along with a handwritten copy of Eleanor's final note discovered in the library. "Some homes are not built to last forever," he read aloud. "They are built to teach people how to find their way back to themselves before letting them continue the journey." Looking across the audience, I realized many people were smiling not because they had restored an old house, but because they understood exactly what those words meant. When the applause faded and we stepped away from the stage, Emily quietly slipped her hand into mine for the first time. The gesture was natural, gentle, and completely unhurried, as though it belonged there long before either of us had found the courage to acknowledge it. We continued walking through the holiday market hand in hand, stopping to admire handmade ornaments, listening to a local choir sing familiar carols, and sharing hot apple cider while fresh snow drifted softly through the evening sky. In that ordinary moment surrounded by ordinary people, I understood something restoration had been teaching me all along. The most meaningful transformations rarely arrive with dramatic fanfare. They happen one careful choice, one honest conversation, and one quiet act of trust at a time, until one day you look around and realize the life you once believed was broken has become more beautiful than anything you ever expected to build. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, replacing snow with fields of fresh green and filling the streets with the familiar sound of open windows, singing birds, and neighbors greeting one another after another long Michigan winter. Nearly 6 months had passed since I first walked through the doors of the Whitmore house, believing I was accepting nothing more than another restoration project. Looking back, it was difficult to recognize the woman I had been then. She measured every day by what she had lost. She believed love belonged to another chapter of her life. She trusted old furniture more than her own future. That woman had quietly disappeared somewhere between cedar chests, handwritten journals, shared cups of coffee, and countless ordinary conversations that slowly taught me extraordinary lessons. My studio had become busier than ever, not because I advertised more but because people talked. Families arrived carrying forgotten heirlooms and left carrying something else as well, the quiet reassurance that broken things did not automatically become worthless. Emily still stopped by nearly every afternoon, although now nobody in town seemed surprised to see her there. Customers smiled knowingly, the cafe owner prepared our usual order before we reached the counter, and even the mail carrier joked that my antique clocks finally had someone worth keeping time for. One Saturday morning, Emily invited me for a drive without telling me where we were going. We followed winding country roads until familiar maple trees appeared along the horizon. The Whitmore house stood exactly where memory had left it, but one detail had changed. A freshly painted wooden sign rested beside the entrance. Whitmore Heritage Learning Center. Emily parked the car and turned toward me with a smile that somehow managed to hold both excitement and nervousness. "The sale never happened," she said softly. Several local donors stepped forward after the restoration was completed. The foundation decided the house should remain open as a place where people can learn traditional preservation skills, study family history, and volunteer together. I stared at the sign for several long seconds before laughter escaped me, bright and completely unplanned. We walked slowly through the front door where sunlight once again filled the library exactly as it had on the afternoon we discovered Eleanor's first letter. Almost everything remained the same. The cedar chest rested beneath the window. The grandfather clock marked another peaceful hour. Eleanor's journals occupied their shelves as though patiently waiting for future readers. Yet the house somehow felt even more alive than before, because this time it was filled with quiet voices, curious visitors, and volunteers carefully learning the same restoration techniques that had changed both of our lives. Before we left, Emily led me to the library table where one final envelope rested beneath a sheet of glass. The handwriting was instantly familiar. It read, "Every restored home deserves new laughter. Every healed heart deserves new hope. If you have reached this page with someone standing beside you, then remember this. Love is never the reward for becoming perfect. Love is what gently reminds us we were always worthy of being chosen." I looked at Emily as emotion quietly filled the silence between us. We did not need grand speeches because the life we had built together had already become the answer to every fear we once carried alone. As we stepped back outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, I realized restoration had never truly been about repairing antiques, preserving buildings, or protecting history. It had always been about believing that time, loss, and disappointment could shape a life without defining its ending. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin long after people stop expecting miracles. Sometimes healing arrives disguised as ordinary days shared with an extraordinary person. And sometimes the greatest treasure waiting to be restored is simply the quiet courage to believe that your happiest chapter has not already been written, but is only just beginning.